So like I was mentioning, my name is Federica, I'm from Uruguay. I've been working in technology for governments for almost a decade now. And I know what you're thinking is that I don't look a day over 20, and that's okay as well. And so I've been working in technology for governments for a very, very long time. And for the first, I would say 7 or 8 years, I was obsessed with efficiency. That was the key to everything I did. Is this saving us time? Is this saving us money? Is this making things speedier and better and tighter? And so that kind of drove how I worked. And I thought that was a great service in working in the public sector. I was convinced that by making things more efficient, I was making tax dollars go further, and I was making people's lives better because they didn't have to wait in line, or they didn't have to fill out a lot of paperwork or go to an interview in order to get a service, et cetera. And sometime in 2016, I saw this. I was looking through my feed reader, came across a ProPublica investigation, and the title read, "There's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks." And this blew my mind, because all of a sudden, that core belief that driving technology, driving efficiency through my profession could be damaging people that I was trying to help the most. I was determined to work for the public sector in order to have impact across the board, and especially for people in need, people in dire situations, people who are not usually benefited by advances and the cutting edge. And so I read this, and it kind of shook my foundation as a technologist to know that all of the automation and all of the efficiency was carrying over our truth as humans, which is that we have biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious. We tend to categorize things and people, and inherently we tend to discriminate one over the other. And so, why does this matter now? Magic, okay. Does anyone know what these are? They're pictures, that is correct. They're actually, they're pretty pictures. They're called Shirley cards. And I can tell there are not a lot of many photography aficionados, because Shirley cards were used in the 60s and 70s to kind of determine what a normal skin tone was when you were developing a film. And so people in labs, you would drop off your roll of film to get your photos developed, and people in labs would match the grays and the reds and the blues to make sure that skin tones look good when they develop the photos. And they would do this over and over again with these cards. And so, can anyone tell me what all these lovely ladies have in common? They are very white. And so for years and years and decades, there are family pictures of people of color that are not showing their features properly. And this was in the 60s and the 70s. Jean-Luc Godard said that he would not work with Kodak because their film was racist. There was some controversy around it. And after a while, they discovered that it was because the film it didn't consider that people of color were going to be shot with it. It wasn't a limitation. It wasn't about color spectrum. It was just the treatment or the prioritization of colors wasn't the right thing. They just didn't take it into account. They didn't consider that they would be part of the audience. The interesting thing is that in the 70s and 80s, the formula for film got changed by Kodak, but it was because advertising needed to start shooting chocolate and dark wood. So not really about race, more about being able to show a cute table. So this is just an example to show, okay, sure, systemic bias and discrimination incorporated into our daily lives is not a new thing. It's been with us for a really long time, but it does matter now. So this is kind of funny, but also very sad. In 2015, Google released Google Photos, and they immediately realized that they were tagging people of color as gorillas, especially African Americans. And it was terrible, and they were appalled a few hours after this came up. Their chief AI person was on the internet apologizing profusely and kind of very embarrassed. But it's 2018, and we figured out, Wired figured out, and I'm just telling you about it, that, well, that's what I do. Wired figured out, by comparing and kind of reverse engineering the algorithm, that they just removed the term gorilla. They didn't really fix anything. They just fixed the fact that it could match to something. So you can find orangutans, you can find apes, but you can't find gorillas in Google Photos anymore because they just didn't fix the algorithm. Instead of trying to say this is a person of color, it's a human. So, you know, sometimes these things come up and they're a controversy, but then there's a quick fix and no one is looking at the inherent problem. And it becomes, facial recognition specifically becomes a real problem with gender and race. This analysis looked at Microsoft, IBM, and Face++. And when you read about these, you're trying to buy them or whatever, it tells you that they're 99% accurate. And that's crazy, because you're like, that's good. That's a dismissible amount of error. I can work with that. But then when you try to drill down, you can see that white men are 99% accurate. But then if you go to people with darkened skin tones, it goes up to 12%. And if you go women of darker skin tones, it goes up to 35%, which is crazy, because it's 1 in 3 people. And, you know, so far, the examples we're giving, they're okay. I mean, they're not dangerous, right? No one's getting hurt. You might be offended if you're sensitive, whatever, but they're not dangerous, right? That's what a lot of people tell themselves. That's okay. So now we talk about Amazon, which some of you might be familiar with. So Amazon has been developing their facial recognition software called Recognition for a while now, and it's marketed for law enforcement. And what it does is it gathers input images, cross-matches it against mugshots and criminal records, and says if there's a match or there's not a match, and hopefully this will make law enforcement a lot more efficient and finding suspects and people committing crimes a lot easier. And so the ACLU run a study, and they ran every person in the US Congress against this algorithm. And they found 28 false positives, 28 people in Congress that were said to have committed crimes and not have. And the even more shocking part of that was that even though only 20% of people in Congress are people of color, 39% of the false positives were people of color. So in and of itself, you might think, maybe this is not that dangerous. It's people of Congress. We know that they haven't committed crimes. We have in-depth analysis of their backgrounds, et cetera. Well, you know what I mean, guys. Come on. Yeah, I know where you're laughing. Anyway, however, I'm sure you're all aware, especially in America, a lot of problems with police brutality. A woman got murdered by a police person, and that term may be controversial, because the system in the cop car falsely identified her license plate as a stolen car. And when she denied the fact, she got shot and she died. And so if we bring that to this technology, and tomorrow it's incorporated into a body cam, a cop car, anything, and you can blame police brutality on a false positive from a software that has not been tested in people of color who are probably the most vulnerable in these situations, then that becomes a big, big, big problem, and it's life or death at that point for a lot of people. And so it's really something to look at. This is CEO Barbie. I like her because back in 2011, this is not true today, but back in 2011, if you Googled images CEO, the first female image you saw was CEO Barbie. Before any female CEO, despite women making up, I think, 27% of the female workforce, the CEO workforce, only 11% of the Google image results are female. So there's still a little bit of disparity there. So Amazon, too, had a recruiting system, and this has also been in a lot of media and stuff like that. And they realized after a while that because historically candidates had been male, and they were trying to figure out how high performers represented on their resume, they incorporated all of this data that ended up having a very, very strong bias against women, including CEO Barbie. And, and so words like women's or saying you were captain of the women's chess club were discriminated against, and you were taken to the bottom of the pile for no real reason at all other than being a nerd. And so the technology also favored candidates that spoke like men. And there's nothing wrong in speaking like a woman or using more traditionally female terms, but when you normalize that and it turns up to work against you, again, it becomes a really big problem. And so back to our question, why this matters today. Today, there's a lot of money in AI, and it's getting more and more adopted every day. I'm sure a lot of you, how many of you do machine learning algorithms, AI? Not that many, great. It's okay, you're still in time. But yeah, so a couple numbers, by 2021, it's expected that organizations will spend over $50 billion a year in AI solutions. And it's estimated that in 2030, $15 trillion will be contributed by value created by AI solutions. So this is gigantic, and it is great. I am not advocating that we stop the wheel, not do AI, let's all go home, static for everyone, no. But we need to think about these things. We need to think about whether we are normalizing historic discrimination. Are we feeding data into our algorithms that it's making it completely legal, completely repeatable, and scalable to oppress people who have been oppressed for the longest time? And so, how do we get there? Here. The simple answer is, if data isn't fair or just, the outputs of that data won't be fair or just. I always say, people tell me, data doesn't lie, and I agree with that. But we need to really look for the truth in the data that we're inputting to our algorithms, because it brings all of the human error, whether it's a nominal error or a unconscious bias that we're bringing there, it's bringing all of that history of oppression and discrimination and lack of opportunity and lack of acceptance into a recorded, repeatable process. And so the data is the key to having a fair algorithm. Now, there's a bigger question, and we probably won't be able to solve that today, which is, what is fair? We can't get into that. There's a lot of definitions of fairness. It will be up to each of you, if you end up doing something like this, to work with what is best suited for your use case, your history, your culture, your environment, etc. But for now, let's just say you can't be discriminated for something you were born with, or you can't be discriminated for something that you just are. And so the data is the key, and there are ways to go around this. It's not just a matter of life and death. But also, I felt like my deck looked very Star Wars-y, so I had to include something Star Wars, and so I made this meme. So if you're like me and you're designing things with the goal of making organizations, whether they're public or private, work better for their people, and then you end up propagating bias, you kind of become the very thing you swore to destroy, right? You're propagating unfairness, and we don't want that. Obi-Wan does not want that. And so what's being done today, and I think this is where it gets interesting, I was mentioning before I started the talk, I've been giving this talk, a similar talk on this subject, for about a year and a half. And it's funny because every time I'm about to get on the stage the week before or something like that, I do a new round of research, right? I try to get updated, see if there's anything new out there, et cetera. And 2018 has been crazy. There have been so many advances. This has been such a topic in everyone's mind. And it has propagated against tech giants and trickled down to smaller companies. This is 2018. I'm going to go over some of them. So Facebook says it has a tool to detect bias in its artificial intelligence. I don't know if we believe them, but they say they do. And they have, and this is trustworthy information, they have built an ethics team, and their AI ethics team now works across all of the AI initiatives. So they audit everything that they do to make sure that it's not biased, or at least that it's biased according to their business plan. Microsoft is creating an oracle for catching bias in algorithms, but haven't really released any code. Paymetric is really interesting, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in a while. But they have open source audit AI, and it's basically a bias detection tool. It's very, very interesting. Google has an education guide, so basically telling you what to look for, what not to look for, and where. And Accenture has a toolkit. I've looked into that. It's fine. So automated algorithm audits, though, this is the biggest one I've found lately. IBM launched the AI Fairness 360 Python package, and it's an open source package. You can all go see it in GitHub. It's pretty comprehensive, but even so, it just scratches the surface. The image we're seeing, though, is very interesting because at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that ProPublica study that brought me to the subject, where parolees, or people up for parole, were judged by an algorithm to determine whether they were likely to reoffend. And it was biased against people of color. And so they have replicated that algorithm and put it as one of the examples in the demo. And through their 10 algorithms and 5 of their metrics, they found out that it's biased against men and it's biased against people of color. So black men being at the worst of the discriminated against group in this case, and the most vulnerable group in this case as well. So it's looking pretty good. Something that's really interesting to me is that even though the use cases that they've covered are very, very, very limited, they still use over 70 fairness metrics, 70 definitions of what is fair. And as a developer, you have to go in, decide which one fits your standard the most, or make your own, and incorporate that into your testing algorithm. These are the algorithms that they have, so just different kinds of classifiers, and they are, again, very interesting because they're open source and they can be combined and tweaked to fit your use case. And they also have metrics that are kind of output to measure whether an individual is being discriminated against, a group, or other indicators of figuring this out. This is very important, even though it feels like a small initiative, because it's the first kind of tool of this type. And it was released 2 months ago. It's not even a super acknowledged thing. I discovered it not long ago. And so I think it's big that it's open source. I think it's really important to be transparent and open a collaborative environment to talk about these things. I will reach out to IBM to learn more about it. But in the meantime, I really do feel like this type of initiative is where we need to go, and as technical people, try to test our knowledge. I think it's really easy when we're working on our stuff to think that we're above this, that we are not people who discriminate. We are kind people. We say hi to our neighbors, and we don't discriminate against diverse people in our community. But we are. We all have unconscious bias, no matter who you are, no matter if you are a minority. That does not exclude you either. And so being able to test your algorithms, whether it's with Software or an external audit or anyone who can give an objective view on whether someone is getting left out is key to a healthy AI future. So the other thing that's being done today is disruption in traditionally biased systems. And the first one is Pymetrics, which I'd mentioned before. And Pymetrics is really interesting because it has taken recruitment, which, again, traditionally is biased against women and also sometimes people of color or people of different cultures by name or other traits that they have. And they've used neuroscience and over 150 pre-identified biases to create custom models for each one of their clients. And so they run the model, see if any particular group is being excluded, deweigh the metrics that are excluding those people, and then run it again, and until it meets their standard of fairness. But like I'm saying, it still requires a lot of human evaluation. It still requires a human component to bring that definition of fairness and teach it to its models and propagate. And the next one is Upstart. So I'm an immigrant of the United States. I've been there for 5 years. And when I just moved, it was impossible for me to rent an apartment because I didn't have a credit history. And even though I worked a tech job with an okay salary and I had a lot of credit history in other countries I've lived, the US government didn't have any record of me being trustworthy. And so I had to live with roommates for a long time. It wasn't that fun. But basically, that algorithm just saw me for one thing. Upstart is a company that gives out loans. Obviously, they have a business case. It's not, they're not doing charity. But basically, they're saying the credit score is not the best way to evaluate someone for their credit worthiness. And they've introduced new algorithms that try to remove biases and incorporate new variables, and they have found that they can lend money to twice as many people with the same amount of risk. Same amount of people foreclose loans for them that they do with traditional banks, but twice as many can borrow. So that kind of reinventing the wheel is a good workaround for systems that have been traditionally biased and are very ingrained in our culture. For example, credit scores, which are very dear to my heart because they hurt me all the time. And there are more and more companies like these that are starting to come up and work with specific technology and communities to find what works for them and how much they can mitigate and reduce bias in their environment. The other thing that's going on, and this has been happening for many more years than the IBM thing and these new companies, there are organizations that just focus on evaluating algorithms out there, seeing if bias is present, receiving submissions from people who think they've been treated unfairly by machine learning algorithm or some sort of sorting system. Two that I really like are Algorithm Watch and the Algorithm Justice League. The Algorithm Justice League was founded by Joy, I always forget her last name, Wolamwini, and she has a really good TED Talk, which I'm mentioning there. Really, really worth looking at. But she, as a person of color, has suffered this firsthand and decided to take action. A lot of people volunteer at her organization, and you can too if this is a subject that interests you. And people can submit their requests to have their algorithms evaluated as well as have their use cases evaluated if they feel personally attacked. And I think this is really valuable because it was a grassroots movement that started before people could automate the debiasation of algorithms. And then another really, really big one is policy and regulation. It's our friend, GDPR. I'm sure it gives all of you nightmares, but I really like it. So one of the things that GDPR does in this terms is really, really important is it forbids profiling. So it's illegal under GDPR for someone to say that because you are a certain way, you act a certain way. And that is very important. The second one is it promotes a right to an explanation. So if you're declined for a loan today, you'll go, and there's a woman or the man, he's typing in the computer, and then it says no, and it's just like, the computer says no. And that's it, that's all you get. Yeah, you've all had this. And then you're like, but why? And the computer says no. And that's all you get. So under GDPR, you do have a right to an explanation if you get automatically disqualified or lose an opportunity. You get at least legal right for someone to explain what's the process behind this. What are you weighing that is making me not worthy? And the third one is a law against bias and discrimination. So you can't use data to actively discriminate against someone, again, for a quality that they cannot control. So this is really important. Since GDPR, there have been other policies that have come up. Los Angeles has passed really progressive policy around data. A lot of other states and countries are promoting laws that protect people. And within those, bias is a big thing that usually doesn't get spoken about a lot. So it's not only about protecting your privacy, but it's also about protecting your right as an individual to have opportunity and have access to the same things as others. So at this point, at this point, we're asking ourselves, great, you've told me all these things, it's terrible, I'm never going to build an algorithm again because it's going to ruin the world and people of color are going to be murdered by police. No. And so there are a few things that I always think are very, very useful. The first one is diversity. If you build something that would discriminate against you, it's very unlikely that it'll get to production. If you're testing an algorithm and you input your own data in there, and it would tell you no for no other reason than your gender, the color of your skin, your ethnicity in general, culture, or anything like that, you would not allow that to happen. And so by having more diverse teams, you're broadening your ability to see what the liabilities in your models are. I know sometimes that is not available. I know sometimes really diverse teams are not easy to come by, but a conscious effort to make your teams look like the people you're serving is really, really important. And the second one is awareness. I don't know, I think at this point, this is in the media enough that people know it's going on, but a year ago, I would come up and give talks and people would be like, I had no idea this was a thing. And so if you are a team leader and you have enough privilege to not be aware that bias exists, not only in humans, but now in models, please propagate the word. It's important for people to be aware that these things happen, that there is a risk, that people can be affected by this in every level. So that's the second one. Eek. Third one is regulation. People in this room probably not the best or the most accurate crowd for this, but if you can advocate for passing policy in your district, in your area, in your country, regulation is really important, and we need technical people to help write that regulation because, as you probably know, when non-technical people write the documentation, doesn't go very well. And so, fourth one is transparency. And this one is really important to me. I am a firm believer in open source, and I know that's always not an opportunity people get. But if you're building an algorithm that will have the ability to destroy someone's life or deny them of opportunity, deny them of access, the more transparent you are, the better it will be. If people can look at how you're building things, the data you're using, and identify these things for you, it's a great opportunity. And I think transparency in general will protect a lot of the people building these models in the future because they will allow for visibility to protect them. And the fifth one is testing and QA, and I think this is where this crowd comes in the most. I think automated testing and having the ability to similarly to how IBM does it, run pre-processors or pre-algorithms that analyze the data and try to identify if there are biases present, trying to automate this as much as possible, trying to grow the definition of fairness, trying to grow the scope of what we're doing. I think it's really, really important. I think by combining all of the technical parts with all of the cultural parts, we can really come together to create something that makes the world a lot more efficient and a lot better for everyone, which I know is kind of the cliche tech thing, and I wish I had the Silicon Valley gift, but I don't. But we really are trying, a lot of us, to make the world a better place, and I think by combining all of these tips and tricks and trying to make our outputs fairer than our ancestors' data, we can really have a major impact on everyone. It's life. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. Does anybody have questions for her? Yep. This is a moment where I lose all I eat here, running around the room.
Do you know of any initiative to use these systems as integration tests in order to consider the data not as an input for these systems, but as an output for another system that we would want to test and correct?
There are no standardized tests for this. I think that's your question. The IBM initiative is open source, and it's meant so that you can tweak it. And the architecture for that is preprocessors to the algorithm. So it processes the data, looks for biases, goes back, tweaks the weights, and then goes to your model. That is the first of its kind, and like I mentioned before, it was released only 2 months ago. There are no standardized tests the way we know them in software in general, and maybe at some point, but not yet.
Questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk. You talked a lot about biases and algorithms, but if we go back to the problem with faces and face recognition, and when they put people from Congress to that system, don't you think that if we remove biases from the systems, it will actually ethically justify the violence and injustice which people intend to do with these algorithms, like automatic recognition of possible criminals?
It's a tough one, and I've been asked this before. I think biases are unfair, and that's my opinion. I don't think that you can judge someone solely by that. You can judge someone by their past actions. That is okay. An example is, for example, redundancy. The parole model that I mentioned twice in my talk, it didn't necessarily input race as an indicator. It didn't really say, oh, people of color are more likely of committing a crime, but it did input things like you live in this and that neighborhood, which is usually for people who have less money and traditionally oppressed people, so people of color. It asked things like, has any family member of yours ever been in jail? And so there were not direct questions about the person's history. There were not how many crimes have you committed, how much time have you spent in jail, how many offenses have you committed while being incarcerated. All those things are criteria that will directly lead to an analysis on that person. A psychological evaluation of the individual would lead to an analysis of that person. But your neighborhood where you grew up with, which you had no control over because your family could not have afforded a better neighborhood. If your family members did something that you could have not controlled because your family is just given to you. Those are things that traditionally translate to people who are more oppressed and have no they have no impact over it. So if I was born with this, and you're telling me that I'm a lot more likely to commit a crime than someone who had privilege, then that for me is where it matters. So I completely agree. There's a lot of opportunity to make the world a much safer place by using AI. We just need to make sure that what we're inputting there really speaks to the individual and not to environmental causes or natural things that they have and own. And I think that's where the difference between a bias and an analysis is. Does that answer your question?
The question was more... I kind of understand, but I just want to hear it from you. Do you think that using AI in such things as crime prediction and well, one people actually hurting other people, because that's what we do to criminal convicts. We're hurting them, we limiting their freedom, we act in some way like this woman which was killed.
Yes.
Right? Do you think that it's justified? Are we even allowed ethically to use AI to direct us to hurt other people?
Yeah, I think so, responsibly, but yes. I just think that things where vulnerable people are more targeted, we need to be more responsible about it. We just need to pay more attention. But I am a fierce advocate of AI, and like I said at the beginning, one of my biggest obsessions to this day is efficiency. So if we can automate fairness, then that's great. We can catch the bad guys, we can leave the good guys alone, and we'll all be happy. I think the goal is just to flag that there's a risk of just propagating the way we've always been. And so, you know, I don't want to get into politics, but we know that police people tend to target people of color more. And they probably don't do it on purpose. It's probably part of how they're wired. But it does become a problem. And so if you capture that data and input that into AI and propagate that, that becomes a problem.
I don't know the order, but okay. I optimize the path, not the...
Sorry for taking the opportunity. So thanks for your talk. And it would seem from the outside that any organization wishing to grow a capability in either artificial intelligence or machine learning would have to make quite a big financial investment. So in your view, with increased regulatory oversight and compliance requirements, how would organizations that have already made such investments retain their commercial competitiveness?
By not getting sued? That's a short answer. It's a matter of ethics and responsibility. If you invest more, in my opinion, the rewards are larger. Unfortunately, empirically, I am wrong because I gave the Amazon example, and we all know that they are not struggling for cash. And so I think it's a matter of, when it comes to the organization level, you have to analyze how much your technology has the ability to impact people in vulnerable situations, right? So how large is your need for this kind of audit, this kind of team, this kind of evaluation? So there you can, in my opinion, gauge what the relevant investment is, right? How much is it worth for you? I think as this progresses, even like I was saying, I've been speaking about this for under 2 years, and the landscape has completely changed. When I started speaking about it, there was no code. There was no code ever written to try to identify bias. No one had ever even looked at it in a way that was inherently technical. And so I would say in the next 5 years, there are going to be open source solutions where you don't have to have an entire ethics team to evaluate your AI. Until then, it's more of a, I guess, rule of thumb of each organization to be as responsible as possible with what they're building.
Hi there.
I don't know, okay.
I guess a similar but different question. You were saying that I mean, I think both of us have backgrounds in digital transformation in governments, but you were saying that, you know, maybe we shouldn't be asking irrelevant questions like where the person grew up and these kind of things, which, you know, you and I can agree that they're the wrong question to be asking, but those questions are there for a reason, and the reason is that someone's put that into policy for some reason which is inscrutable in the past. So that is the policy, and the policy's there so that things are fair. And you said that we should definitely be working with policy colleagues to make things better, but we know that takes a long time. So as a room full of programmers, in the meantime, what are you advocating that we do? How are you advocating that we make a difference, if not kind of vigilantism in some way?
Absolutely. Well, you know, vigilante sounds kind of cool. I think the two key ones, if you're not into talking to politicians, which I will not blame you for, volunteering in some of these organizations that are working on evaluating code. I think it's a really fun exercise for someone who's technical, looking at someone else's algorithm and try to figure out if there's biases and how how the data that has been inputted has been tricking the system. At least for me, as a curious person, it's really interesting. So that's one. The two that I mentioned are only two, but there are a lot of institutes and organizations that are popping up in the last year. I know NYU just released a lab around this subject as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to get into it and try to figure out how these things make it into our models. And I feel like when we understand that better, the solution and the automated audit part will come a lot easier. And the second thing I think you can do is look for these open source projects that are popping up more and more. I can go back to the slide with all of the, oh, I can't. I would go back to the slide with all of the things that have popped up in 2018. A lot of them have been open source by nature. So I think there are more and more projects where people are trying to build algorithms and trying to tackle, at least scratch the surface of this landscape and see what they can do. Like I said, the IBM thing itself is really, really interesting. It has 70 definitions of fairness, and it barely scratches the surface. So there's a lot of work to do.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much for bringing up the subject. Thanks for your talk. It's an area that it's very tempting, but probably very dangerous to avoid at the same time. Is there a case for having a discussion of consequences? So rather than just bias as a general issue, what harm does it do? And kind of using that as some way of evaluating what level of intervention we need to have. If I prefer coffee over tea, maybe there's no consequences. If people are getting shot potentially, that's a different level of scrutiny we need to have. Maybe you have a thought on that, including in this discussion about bias, consequences of bias.
Yeah. It's tricky, right? It's the same as trying to define fairness. I think if I ask the definition of fairness to every person in this room, they'll give me a different answer. Not getting shot. Not getting shot is fair. There you go. So, you know, it's the extremes are really easy, coffee and tea versus not getting shot, pretty black and white. Once you start getting to the middle, that becomes a little bit challenging. What I usually advocate for is know your culture, know your community, and try to get as many points of view as you want. And going back to the diversity thing, if you have the people who are being discriminated against in the room, I'm sure they'll bring it up. You don't look convinced.
If you understand the consequences, it's just, if there's some way to have that discussion about, so what difference is it going to make? And
Right.
it's just another level on top of that conversation.
I agree.
Yeah.
And some of in the IBM model, as well as some of the other automated versions that they're trying to do, it's basically test and learn. So is the fact that you like coffee or tea directly affecting whether you get shot or not? And if If there is a relationship between vulnerable groups and the fact that they like coffee or tea, they just reduce the weight of that. So that's kind of the closest I can get in terms of consequences, where you kind of reevaluate and refeed the data as many times as you need in order to achieve the right level. I get what you're saying. There's just no answer. Okay.
Any more questions?
So you've mentioned the case of the one who got shot. In your opinion, who should be held accountable? The QA, the software developers, the policemen, the people who send the software into production?
Well, definitely the person who shoots, in my opinion. That can be controversial. I know, don't hold me accountable for that. But there's larger responsibility, in my opinion, by the overarching organization who would release that. You, as an employee, you always, that's kind of the benefit of being an employee and not being an individual contractor, right? You're under an umbrella of responsibility and protection of the company who hires you to do your work. So if, as an organization, I'm releasing software that is helping law enforcement identify delinquent people, and it's falsely identifying people and getting them shot, then I think as an organization they should be held accountable as well. Personal opinion, though. There's no policy around it. So again, we need policy.
Okay, let's hear it for Federica. Thank you so much.
Thank you.